Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Ali Aslan.
All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And quite a treat that we have here for this particular session, ladies and gentlemen. This gentleman to my left actually needs no introduction. I'll give him one anyway. He is, of course, a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor. He's been with Harvard University since 1964. He has been and is one of the most influential foreign affairs scholars of our time. He's held security appointments in both the Carter and Clinton administration, and I think you would all agree that his thought leadership has influenced heads of state and policymakers all around the world. It's a great treat and pleasure to have him here, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome Professor Joseph Nye.
Thank you.
Professor Nye, you are perhaps best known for coining the term soft power, of course, which describes the ability of states to attract and persuade others through non-coercive means. One country, of course, that has yielded great soft power, perhaps up until recently, has been your country, the United States, through technologies, through its universities, which has attracted a large number of foreign students, through elements of popular culture. Do you see a decline of U.S. soft power under the current administration, under President Trump?
Yes, it's not a biased statement on my part. The public opinion polls show that we've gone down in attractiveness in other countries, 20, 30 points in some cases. And since the end of the Obama administration. And in London, there's a index, Soft Power 30, done by Portland, which had the United States ranked number 1 in 2016. We're now ranked number 3. But there's no question that if you have somebody whose proclamation is America first, and it tells everybody else they're second, that's not exactly the way to attract people. And we're seeing it in the numbers.
And the Trump presidency has led to an erosion of soft power, says Joseph Nye, but has it ended it yet? It's probably too early, right?
No, it hasn't ended it. And one of the reasons is that America's a lot more than Donald Trump. Has always been and will be after Donald Trump. And the United States gets a lot of its soft power not from the government, but from civil society. Let me give you an example. In Vietnam period, the United States was wildly unpopular. People marching in the streets all over the world protesting U.S. But you know what they sang? They didn't sing the Communist Internationale. They sang Martin Luther King's We Shall Overcome. In other words, an aspect of American civil society was so popular it captured public imagination of people who were bitterly opposed to government policy. And that's one of the reasons why we recovered our soft power after Vietnam.
Now, you're saying, and rightly so, of course, that the U.S. is so much more than Donald Trump. But the truth is, ever since he took office, he's pretty much dominating the scene. He's dominating the headlines and perhaps the image of the United States. Is that unprecedented? You have served under previous administrations. You know U.S. presidents. Is this a first for you in that capacity and that
Well, every president works the media. That's part of the job. But Trump had particular training in reality TV. And what he learned there is a secret is to keep the camera focused on you. And the way you do that is by being outrageous. And as people start responding to your first outrage, you go on to the second outrage. When they catch up to your second outrage, you go to the third outrage. That way, he dominates the agenda. That's what all these tweets are about. So essentially, we're getting all Trump all the time. Doesn't matter whether you watch CNBC or Fox, pro or con, it's all Trump. And that is, unfortunately, a new way of manipulating the media.
And of course, this session is dealing with how to project power in the post-rule world order. The United States still yields a great deal of influence. Now, you could, of course, make the counter-argument, with, in the case of Korea, for instance, that his perhaps outrageous, as you call it, outrageous approach is leading to results, no?
Well, a lot of Trump supporters in the administration will say, oh, well, he's broken the rules, and by breaking the rules, he's broken the system and brought Kim Jong-un to the table. But if you notice what happened, Kim Jong-un did enough tests to be able to show he could hit the United States, and then he turned to sweetness and light. And then Trump said, oh, I did it. Well, you know the great French story about Chanticleer the rooster? He crows and the sun comes up. Trump crows and thinks that that's what brought Kim Jong-un to the table. Kim Jong-un got what he wanted, a missile that can hit the United States and recognition as a nuclear power by the President of the United States.
You famously asked in your last book, is the American century over? Now, that's a book you wrote before Donald Trump was elected or even ran for office. Right. Clearly, you had misgivings back then. You had doubts about the U.S. being able to project its power even prior to Donald Trump.
Oh, absolutely. And I think if you go back to 1945, and the fact that we've had what's sometimes called a liberal international order, in which the United States reacted to its free riding and absence in the 1930s by constructing an order, many people felt that order was coming to an end. I think it was changing dramatically, and it had to change to accommodate other powers, including China. Didn't mean China was getting stronger than the U.S. I don't think it is. But it meant you couldn't solve some problems unless you worked with China. And we were going to have to learn that power is not just power over others, but it's power with others. You cannot solve, for example, climate change, which is going to be devastating for sea levels where I live in Boston, unless you work with China. You can't threaten to bomb China's coal-burning plants. You have to find ways to work with them. So what I wrote in that book, Is the American Century Over? It's not over in terms of America remaining the major power, but it's over in the sense that the Americans are going to be able to tell others what to do. We're going to have to work with others and persuade others. That was over before Trump. Unfortunately, Trump is taking an attitude of, well, we'll go back to telling you what to do. And I think that's a real setback.
Of course, the notion and the fear is that the international liberal order as we know it is diminishing, is under assault. The forum, this particular forum, is dealing with it in numerous panels as well. How important, how relevant is soft power? The term and the concept of soft power that you have coined back then in the 90s, how relevant is it still in the scheme of international affairs?
Well, soft power is crucial in the sense it never solves problems in and of itself. Power is the ability to get what you want, and we usually have a mix of coercion and payment and attraction. But if you have soft power, you can have a force multiplier. You sort of leverage the other instruments you have. So soft power actually creates an enabling environment which then allows you to develop networks of cooperation to deal with many of these issues. So soft power is not the answer, but it remains a crucial part of an integrated answer.
And you have made it clear that you believe that soft power is, or the ability to project soft power is under decline in the United States under President Trump. Which are some of the countries that have increased their leverage, if you will, in terms of soft power?
Well, I probably believe the most dramatic is France. In this Portland index that I mentioned, the soft power 30, France is number one.
Through the election of President Macron?
I think Macron had a very powerful effect on that. And but, you know, small countries can do well with soft power. Very often a country can punch above its weight compared to what it otherwise doesn't become a superpower, but it does have an influence. I would cite Canada, Norway as countries that have had more influence than they would usually if you just assess their military and economic power. Singapore, they take a country of only 5 million people. So soft power is available for any scale of country. and some are more adept at using it and others less so.
Of course, Donald Trump, as we said, is dominating the debate. He's dominating the discourse, even conferences like these, of course. But there will be a time when he will no longer be in office. May it be in 3 years, may it be in 6, 7 years, but he will no longer be around then. But what do you think this current administration, what do you think his presidency, what kind of world will this administration leave behind once it has ended?
Well, I think you're going to see a rising China, which is going to not pass the U.S. but get much closer. I happen to think Russia's in decline. I think Putin is playing a clever tactician's game of taking an energy-based economy which hasn't adjusted to the new information revolution and doing what he can by taking risky actions. But I don't think it's the path to the strong future. So the view that there's an authoritarian axis, China and Russia getting more powerful than the U.S. and Europe, no, I don't think so. Mm-hmm. I think the key question is to make sure that the U.S. and Europe, which have more in common in values than any other two parts of the world, and which combined are a huge part of the world economy, that we don't let that get fractured in the Trump period. And I was interested in the session before this, the question of how do you make sure that in reacting to outrageous things over the next 3 years, 2.5 years, that you try to walk around the damage or limit the damage, because I think we are going to need a U.S.-European cooperation, along with Japan, Australia, Canada, and others, if we're going to recover from this period.
And before we take some questions from the audience, of course we're in Bratislava today, we are in Europe. I don't want to pass up the opportunity of asking you for your assessment about this continent, about the ability of Europe to project soft power, and power in general. Obviously this is a continent that has, if you will, gone from one crisis to the next. It seems that we're in an eternal, perpetual crisis mode here. The view from Boston, the view from the US, the view from Harvard, the view from Professor Nye, where is Europe? Where do you see Europe headed?
Well, I think there's too much Euro pessimism. If you look back on a multi-decade horizon, Europe is a huge success. The idea that Europe could tear itself apart with violence 3 times in 70 years, which it did, that's unthinkable now. And the fact that it's unthinkable means that people don't give Europe enough credit for that. The other thing is Europe has a good deal of soft power. Everybody complains about the Brussels bureaucracy. Who is setting the rules and leading the way on privacy in the internet? Europe. When you come to antitrust cases and how you deal with these new giant companies of a different type, Europe is a crucial player. So the idea that Europe has no power is simply wrong. I wish Europe would do a bit more, NATO on the 2% target and so on and so forth. But let's not devalue Europe, because Europe has accomplished something of world historical importance on the area of suppressing violence. And it's also setting a framework on a number of crucial areas which are going to be important to the future. So I know it's fashionable to complain about Brussels and the Euro democratic deficit and so on and forth, but I think it helps to step back and see that Europe has been really a success story.
So, ladies and gentlemen, particularly to the Europeans of you, you heard it. Professor Nye wants you to be more self-confident about your continent, about your country, about the future.
Well, the short way of putting it is from an American point of view, not the Trump administration, but a longer-term American point of view. I worry not about a Europe that's too strong, but a Europe that becomes too weak.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, let's take 2, 3 comments, questions, rather questions. And as you know, this is a very short and sweet session, 30 minutes in total. I believe we have 15 to 10 minutes left to go. The lady, I believe, had her hand up first. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Marina Kostic from the Institute of International Politics and Economics from Belgrade. So I want to ask you, do you think that the division about unipolar, bipolar, multipolar world still works something? How would you describe the world, and what do you think about international institutions now? Are they valid or they should be changed?
I think these notions of polarity, bipolar, multipolar, unipolar, really confuse us. If you ask in military power, the world is still unipolar. China may be increasing its military capacity, but 2 carriers compared to 10 carrier battle groups, just not the same world. The only country which has global military projection capabilities is the United States. If you think that's the measure, the world's unipolar. But if you go back to what I just said about economic issues, where Europe plays a much more important role, if you look at China's role in economic issues, then the world's multipolar. So is it unipolar or multipolar? And if you ask about climate change, it doesn't make any sense to talk about polarity at all. I think we should drop that whole language. We do need institutions, but the institutions are going to have to be thought of more in terms of networks. How do we get networks which are flexible and can deal with particular issues? So we need the institutional structures we have. I hate to see them trashed in the way some of them are being trashed, but we're going to need to supplement them with a lot more flexible networks.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Philip Blond from Res Publica in London. If you look at sort of the West now, what you're seeing is values fragmentation in multiple areas. According to Pew Research, for example, Americans have never been so divided on values questions as they are now. And we see similar value fractures, epistemological fractures across the whole of Europe. How might one recover from this using the language of soft power? Because the trouble with the soft power assumption is it assumes you're together. Can we deploy soft power in an era where the governing liberal consensus is no longer a consensus? How can we draw on the insights to reform consensus in now very divided Western polities?
Well, it's a great question, but there are 2 things to note. One is the political parties are more divided than the public. The public opinion is still a bell-shaped curve. It depends partly on what questions you ask, but if you ask a question like, would you rather live in the United States or some other country, very powerful common values in a bell shape. So if you ask a question about abortion, abortion rights, you'll get this polarity. But it's not quite as bad. Depends how you pick your poll and what question you ask. But I think the point is that there is still a very strong, in the United States in terms of values, there's a very strong patriotism. You look at some of the successful new candidates running for Congress this year, they're veterans, and they're able to appeal not through identity politics, but through having served. Doesn't make them right-wing or militarists. Several of them are my former students, but they're people who say, I want to serve my country. So I'm not quite so pessimistic that the U.S. will hold together and be able to project a degree of soft power, but it may be projecting it more through Hollywood and Harvard and the Gates Foundation than through the State Department and the Voice of America.
Let's take a couple of more questions. You have the mic. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, Adrian Neumann from the Institute for Security Policy at the University of Kiel in Germany. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm for the European Union. I wonder how you see the term Fortress Europe nowadays. It used to be a term connected that Europe would try to shut off itself from outside influences, especially in migration, and when we were sort of criticizing immigration policy of Australia or walls in Mexico. And do you see nowadays that probably...
I didn't cut you off. But I think we got the gist. I think we got the gist of the question.
It's a great question because the migration is a powerful generator of populism and right-wing populism. And if we're trying to preserve democracy in European countries, we have to realize that that is simply a political fact. When Angela Merkel made her famous statement and gesture in 2015, I thought, my God, what a tremendous moral gesture. This is the Lutheran pastor's daughter saying, I can do no other. Wonderful morality, as it turned out to be disastrous politics. Look at what it did for the AfD. So we have to find ways in which we preserve our liberal values, but impress upon our people that we have the situation under control. We haven't totally lost control. The borders still exist. And that means there are going to have to be limits and quotas and better border enforcement. Schengen, if it's to be preserved, has to show a stronger capacity to preserve the area as a whole. So that, to me, is not Fortress Europe, but it is a realistic assessment of the fact that if liberals don't show that they can manage the problem, they're going to lose control of the problem, and it's going to be run by people a lot worse.
And a topic, of course, that has led to a great divide here in Europe. Last question, go ahead, please.
Paul Taylor from Politico and Friends of Europe. Joe, I'd like to hear your advice to us Europeans on how do we manage the Trump situation. A lot of us are scratching our heads and asking ourselves, what do we do when our guardian superpower goes rogue? What's the right mix of standing up to Trump, accommodating Trump, challenging Trump, cuddling, hugging Trump? Can you give us your recipe?
Well, there's no one easy answer, and I suppose if one had to boil it down to one tweet or one bumper sticker, it would be patience or perseverance. I hope this will be 2.5 more years. One can never be sure, but we have to limit the amount of damage that we do to our relationship as we cope with this. And that means, obviously, some instances where you have to stand up powerfully for particular interests, but others in which you may, as Macron has done, and as Abe has done in Japan, you realize that when you're dealing with a narcissist, flattery won't get you everywhere, but it'll get you a long way. And so there's a mixture of measures, Paul, some tough, some diversionary, but the goal ought to be how do we preserve as much as we can so that in a post-Trump era, when we have to deal with the kinds of things I was writing about in my book, Is the American Era Over?, that the U.S. and the Europeans are placed to repair the damage and go on with the important tasks.
Is the American century over? You ask, implying correctly that the 20th century, I think most, if not all, he would agree, was the American century, certainly dominated by your country. Now, we're in the 21st century. We're pretty early in, so I'm not going to ask the impossible of you. But looking at the trends, even within the first 18 years, in 82 years, what century will we be talking about?
Well, I think it's going to be a mixed century, and I think the two largest economies and most powerful countries will probably be the U.S. and China. But remember, India is about to pass China in population by 2050, the ranking by population will be India, China, U.S. U.S. is the only country that maintains its demographic standing among the rich or developed countries. Also, in terms of flexibility and power, I think that China is not going to be passing the U.S. I think it's going to be very close. My summary of this is probably best described by a response I got from Lee Kuan Yew, the former minister mentor of Singapore, and which I asked him a couple of years ago, what do you think? You watch these countries well. Who do you think is going to prevail in this 21st century? He said the Chinese are going to get very close. They're going to give you a real run for your money. But the Chinese can draw upon the talents of 1.3 or 1.4 billion people. You can draw on the talents of 7.5 billion people, and you recombine them with a diversity which creates much greater creativity than you can ever get with ethnic Han nationalism. This, of course, said by an ethnic Han. I think that's probably about right. That people will look at AI and say, oh, the Chinese, more data, the machines will learn faster, they'll beat us. Well, not if the question is which algorithm is most effective for which segment of AI, in which it may be that a centralized control system pushes everybody toward one area, and in fact the helter-skelter chase a lot of rabbits down a lot of holes is more likely to pay off. I think Lee Kuan Yew is probably right. So my bet would be you'll see an America in the strongest position, a China very close, and if Europe can pull its act together, Europe will still be a major player. The big question to my mind is what happens to Russia? And you might say, well, it's in decline, don't worry, except remember, there's a good comment to end on perhaps in a former Habsburg city, that in World War I, it was the declining country, Austria-Hungary, which was the most risk acceptant. And declining countries are much more dangerous than rising countries. So I think what happens with Russia and how it adjusts to change is the part of this prediction you're asking me for, which worries me most.
And before we end this session, we started with Donald Trump. I'm afraid we have to end with him again. What do you think, Professor Nye? Will he be a footnote in U.S. history and world history, or do you think this is a man whom we will be remembering for a long time?
If Trump is not re-elected in 2020, I think we'll look back from 20, 30, or 40 and say that he was a blip. Look at the weird George Wallace-like character that in this case got to be president, not because the majority voted for him, but because of the oddities of the electoral system in 2016. So in that sense, it'll be a blip. If he gets re-elected, and he can then do more damage for 4 more years, he may turn out to be a turning point. Now, will he be re-elected? I think probably not. But whenever you make a prediction, ask what could make you wrong. One thing would be if there were a 9/11 type crisis just before an election, then Americans rally around the president no matter who he is. And that's enough to push him over 50% from his sort of his hardcore 35%. And if the Democrats or the anti-Trump forces split with a left-center split, then you could split the anti-Trump vote and his 35-40% could get him reelected. I don't think either of those are likely, but I wish I felt better about it. So I'll bet you he won't be re-elected, but my bet will be 10 euros, not 10,000 euros.
Well, that's a bet I'm sure some here will take. Well, ladies and gentlemen, even within this short amount of time, Professor Nye, you have proven and shown us once again why you are one of the most influential foreign affairs scholars of our time. It's been a privilege talking to you, ladies and gentlemen. Joseph Nye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Now, let me just alert you to the fact, of course, we now have another coffee break, but please be back here in half an hour at 6 p.m. sharp for the session on the Visegrad changing relationship with Europe, with senior ministers from all 4 countries. At the same time, upstairs in Maria Theresia, the subject is the rise of the super company, and very timely, in the Habsburg room, they'll be talking about the moves towards peace in Korea, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention, your involvement, and see you soon. Thank you.